The flight crew, driven by racial prejudice, aggressively mishandled the luggage of a black woman simply because they believed she was not worthy of sitting in first class. Little did they know, she was the new owner of the airline. When the truth was revealed, their world turned upside down. Before diving into this gripping story, share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on meaningful stories like this one. Alice Johnson walked through the bustling airport concourse, where the loudspeaker announcements mixed with the sound of hurried footsteps and hushed conversations. The space resembled a labyrinth of activity, but Alice stood out amidst the crowd with her elegant appearance and confident demeanor. Her tailored black blazer and soft silk scarf draped gracefully around her neck exuded the aura of a modern, successful woman. Yet her eyes carried a hint of contemplation. She recalled the many times she had been underestimated, the doubtful glances and the cutting remarks she had endured. From grand conference rooms to intimate social gatherings, there always seemed to be those who questioned her abilities and worth simply based on her appearance. But Alice never let these memories faze her. Instead, they became the fuel that propelled her forward, making her stronger and more determined with every step. She approached the check-in counter with an air of composure. When it was her turn, she greeted Maddie, the staff member behind the counter, with a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. Maddie, a young woman with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, did not respond immediately. The professional smile Maddie had offered to previous passengers vanished, replaced by a scrutinizing gaze as she looked at Alice. Alice placed her first-class ticket on the counter. Maddie picked it up, her eyes betraying a flicker of suspicion. She glanced at Alice from head to toe, then back at the ticket, as if she couldn't believe the woman standing before her was a first-class passenger. "First class?" Maddie asked, her tone a mix of surprise and mockery. "That's correct," Alice replied, her voice calm but resolute. Maddie flipped the ticket over several times, then turned to Bryce, her colleague. "Bryce, could you check this ticket for me?" she said, deliberately speaking loudly enough for others nearby to hear. Bryce, a tall man with a buzz cut and a smug attitude, took the ticket. He held it up to the light, smirking as though inspecting counterfeit money. Alice remained still, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was its powerful statement. Bryce sneered and returned the ticket after a few seconds of his theatrical inspection. "It's fine," he said, his tone far from friendly. "Thank you very much," Alice replied, taking back her ticket with a gracious smile. She moved to the baggage drop-off area, her hand gripping the strap of her premium leather suitcase. Each step she took was deliberate, yet graceful, as if every movement asserted her rightful place in a space where others presumed she didn't belong. But she couldn't ignore the murmurs and stifled laughter behind her. Maddie and Bryce were exchanging comments, their glances occasionally darting toward Alice. Snide remarks may have been uttered, but Alice didn't turn around. She knew who she was and exactly what she intended to do. Alice continued walking, her footsteps echoing softly but firmly on the polished tile floor. The air in the baggage drop-off area was as busy as always, with loudspeaker announcements mingling with the brief exchanges of staff. Yet, as she approached the counter, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Maddie, who had checked Alice's ticket moments earlier, stood beside Bryce, casting her a deliberately hostile glance. Bryce, still radiating smugness, leaned casually against the counter, as though waiting for his next source of entertainment. The two exchanged knowing looks, acting as though Alice were invisible or unworthy of respectful treatment. When Alice reached the counter and placed her suitcase on the conveyor belt, Maddie leaned over, pretending to be engrossed in the computer screen. Bryce picked up Alice's suitcase, handling it with exaggerated indifference before dropping it onto the belt with unnecessary force. The suitcase wobbled, nearly sliding off the edge. "What a special suitcase," Bryce remarked, his tone dripping with insinuation. Maddie let out a small, mocking laugh, making no attempt to hide her derision. Alice observed the scene, her expression unwavering. "Thank you for your help," she said, her tone calm but laced with subtle irony, daring them to justify their disrespect. Bryce shrugged, offering no reply. Maddie glanced at the suitcase once more, her lips curling into a sarcastic smile, before turning back to her tasks. But the ordeal didn't end there. A middle-aged man named Carl, responsible for baggage handling, appeared with a disheveled demeanor. His uniform was wrinkled, his collar undone, and his movement sluggish. Carl grabbed Alice's suitcase, glanced at her briefly, and then tossed it onto the conveyor belt with the carelessness of handling an inanimate object. The force of the throw flipped the suitcase over, causing a smaller bag inside to nearly spill its contents. Alice frowned but maintained her composure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice measured yet cutting. "Could you please handle that more carefully? That's my personal property." Carl didn't bother to look back, merely shrugging and muttering, "It's luggage. It can take it." He picked up the smaller bag, tossing it back into the suitcase with the same carelessness before turning away without another word. Alice stood her ground, her eyes tracking Carl's every move. It wasn't just disrespect, it was indifference and prejudice, thinly veiled beneath their actions. She didn't need to react immediately because she already knew what she would do next. Every detail, every slight, was being catalogued in her mind. In her thoughts, a plan began to take shape. It wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching a lesson. These actions weren't merely offenses against her, they were indicative of a broader problem, a system she was determined to challenge and change. Alice took a deep breath, turned, and walked away. Behind her, Maddie and Bryce shared another quiet laugh, but Alice didn't look back. Each step she took was steady, like the drumbeat of a gathering storm, waiting for the right moment to unleash its force. Today, they might think she was just another ordinary passenger, but they had no idea that within a few hours they would have to confront the consequences of their actions. Alice boarded the plane with her usual composed exterior, but inside she felt the weight of the recent events pressing down on her. The disdainful looks, the whispered mockery, they were nothing new, yet they still left a bitter taste. She took a deep breath and walked toward the first row of the first-class cabin. Her seat, two-way, was by the window. Before she could set her handbag down, Claire, a flight attendant with neatly tied blonde hair, quickly approached. In her hand was a clipboard, and the smile she offered Alice was a faint shadow of professionalism. "Ma'am," Claire said, her tone tinged with distant formality, "may I see your ticket one more time?" Alice raised her head, her gaze direct yet composed. "I already presented my ticket at the boarding gate," she replied, her voice low but steady. "Yes," Claire said, her lips pressing into a tight line, "but we need to double-check to ensure there's no mistake. I hope you understand." Without further comment, Alice opened her handbag and retrieved the first-class ticket she had already shown twice before. Claire took the ticket and examined it with exaggerated care. She scrutinized it as if searching for an anomaly, something to validate her skepticism. Alice remained silent, her eyes fixed on Claire. After what felt like an eternity, Claire finally handed the ticket back, but not without adding a snide remark. "First class, huh? I guess this must be a special occasion," Claire said, a cold smile briefly flickering across her face. Alice returned the smile with a faint one of her own. "Every flight is a special occasion for me," she said, her tone light but full of unspoken meaning. Claire hesitated for a moment at Alice's reply, but quickly turned and walked away. Meanwhile, Alice could feel other glances from the crew, fleeting, filled with malice, and hear the faint whispers of half-suppressed laughter behind her. Alice took her seat, adjusted the leather bag under her feet, and tried to find a moment of peace in her private space. But the tension lingered. From where she sat, she could hear Claire talking to a colleague in the distance. "She must have won the lottery to sit here," Claire said, her voice just loud enough for Alice to catch. A male voice responded, likely Rick, the senior flight attendant. Or found someone generous to sponsor her. Both of them chuckled softly. Alice didn't turn her head. She sat still, her eyes fixed on the window, but her mind churned. Such comments were not new, but their constant repetition, always from people who thought she didn't belong, was something she could no longer ignore. In the seat beside her, Anna Miller, a young passenger with lightly curled brown hair, sat quietly observing. Anna had witnessed everything, from the check-in counter to the first-class cabin. She had watched how Claire scrutinized Alice's ticket and heard the veiled comments, feeling increasingly uncomfortable on Alice's behalf. Without a word, Anna discreetly pulled out her phone. Pretending to check her messages, she began recording the entire interaction. Every glance and every gesture from the flight crew was captured. Anna didn't know who Alice was, but she could see clearly that this woman was enduring unacceptable treatment. Alice caught sight of Anna out of the corner of her eye. Part of her wanted to acknowledge the quiet solidarity, but she chose to remain silent. Today was not the day to seek sympathy. When Claire passed by again, their eyes met. This time, Alice shed her passive demeanor. She tilted the corner of her mouth into a faint smirk, her gaze sharp enough to unsettle Claire. "Enjoy your flight," Claire said, her tone laced with mockery, before quickly walking away. Alice responded in a calm but weighty tone. "Oh, I certainly will." The tension in the cabin didn't dissipate. It only thickened, like a storm gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Alice sat quietly, her eyes gazing out the window as the plane began loading luggage into the cargo hold. Through the thick glass, she spotted her suitcase, distinguished by its black and gold trim, being lifted by a baggage handler. Instead of carefully placing it onto the cart, the man tossed it down as if it were a worthless object. The suitcase flipped, tumbling onto its side, and a smaller bag inside nearly spilled out, teetering on the edge. Alice clenched her teeth but maintained her composure. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed such blatant disrespect, but the repeated disregard for her belongings pushed her to take action. She pressed the flight attendant call button, her eyes never leaving the window. Within seconds, Rick, the senior attendant, appeared. He approached with a lethargic air, a faint smirk on his face that betrayed a lack of genuine concern. "Is there something you need, ma'am?" Rick asked, his tone dripping with indifference, as though he were dealing with a trivial matter. Alice turned to face him, her voice calm but firm. "I just watched my luggage being thrown carelessly onto the cart. It appears to have been damaged. I'd like to ensure it is thoroughly inspected upon landing." Rick glanced out the window briefly, then shrugged dismissively. "It's just luggage," he said, his tone carrying an undertone of condescension. "We handle hundreds of bags a day. A little damage here and there is normal." Alice's eyes narrowed, her hands lightly clasped on her lap as she controlled her emotions. "It's not just luggage. It's my personal property, and I expect it to be treated with respect." Rick chuckled softly as if her words were amusing. Crossing his arms, he tilted his head at her. "We'll make a note of it if you insist, but I'd suggest not blowing this out of proportion. This isn't the first time baggage has had issues, you know." The surrounding atmosphere grew tense. Nearby passengers began to pay attention to the exchange. A few turned to watch, including Anna Miller, who had been observing the situation from earlier. "Do you think Alice should have reacted more strongly at that moment, such as demanding to speak to a manager immediately? Or was her choice to calmly take note of the details for later action a more effective approach? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Anna set her book aside, her eyes flashing with indignation on Alice's behalf. She raised her voice gently but firmly. "Actually, I've lost luggage before, due to careless handling by the crew. It's not a pleasant experience." Rick turned to face Anna, his earlier confidence wavering slightly. "We always do our best," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Then why does this keep happening?" Anna countered, her voice growing stronger. "If you can't ensure careful handling, the least you could do is show respect when customers raise valid concerns." Other passengers began nodding in agreement. An older man seated nearby muttered, "She's right. I've had the same experience." Feeling the weight of the passenger's gaze, Rick straightened up. He attempted to regain composure with a forced smile. "We'll review this issue when we land. For now, I ask everyone to maintain order as we prepare for the flight." Alice said nothing more. She fixed Rick with a steady, unreadable gaze that carried an unmistakable warning. After a prolonged moment, Rick walked away, though not without a trace of unease. Alice returned to her seat, resuming her composed posture. But, in her mind, every detail was being catalogued. Not just Rick's words, but also his dismissive behavior, the silence of other crew members, and the supportive looks from fellow passengers. Anna glanced over at Alice and offered a small, encouraging smile. "You handled that well," she said softly. Alice acknowledged her with a slight nod of gratitude. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the dark clouds were gathering. Alice knew this was only the beginning. Alice sank back into her seat, taking a deep breath to steady her heartbeat after the confrontation. Through the window, the morning sun streamed in, illuminating the billowy white clouds drifting by. Outside, the scene appeared serene, but inside, Alice still felt the tension permeating the cabin. She did not look back at Rick or Claire, who were now busily feigning activity to avoid the stares of the other passengers. She knew they were trying to hide their unease behind awkward smiles. But Alice did not need apologies at this moment. She was far too accustomed to such behavior, petty, prejudiced, and always accompanied by weak excuses. Opening her handbag, she retrieved her phone and began scrolling through emails. Her fingers moved over work messages until she paused on one with the subject line, "Acquisition completed," from her legal team. Alice opened the email, reading each line carefully. The content was brief but clear. The airline acquisition was finalized. As of that moment, she was officially the largest shareholder and principal owner of the company. A wave of relief and satisfaction swept over Alice. She set the phone down, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and determination. This wasn't just a financial victory. It was a monumental step in her life, a journey she'd begun with nothing. Memories of her early days in business came flooding back. Alice recalled the first time she ventured into the industry, scraping together small loans from friends to fund her initial project. Back then, she had little, no family backing, no significant connections, and certainly no support from those who thought she wasn't worthy. She remembered the rejections from investors who claimed they didn't see potential in her ideas. She had heard phrases like, "We don't think you'll make it in this industry," more times than she could count. But none of them knew that those words only fueled her determination. Alice had worked tirelessly, from dawn until late at night, teaching herself every skill she needed, from financial management to marketing and contract negotiation. She endured countless sleepless nights, facing pressures where even the smallest mistake could have unraveled everything. But through patience and relentless effort, she prevailed. Now, here she was. None of the passengers or crew knew that the woman sitting quietly in first class was the person with the greatest authority over the airline's future. Alice allowed herself a small smile. She folded her phone shut and gazed out the window, where clouds drifted by in endless formations. The whispers behind her, the scrutinizing glances, those were now nothing more than faint echoes. Alice knew. She didn't need to prove anything. Those who had underestimated her would soon realize their error, and sooner than they thought. In the distance, Claire and Rick were still whispering to each other, occasionally casting nervous glances in Alice's direction. Their subdued laughter betrayed their unease, evident in every awkward gesture. They didn't yet know that the game was nearly over. Alice closed her eyes, bringing her thoughts back to the present. The acquisition was complete. Now it was time to act, but not out of anger. Over the years, Alice had learned that patience was always the most powerful weapon. This flight was not just a journey, it was a statement, and what came next would serve as a lesson no one who had doubted her would ever forget. As the plane touched down with a gentle rumble, the familiar sound of applause rippled through the cabin. Alice Johnson unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands calmly adjusting the hem of her sleek black blazer. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the airport grounds unfolded, bustling with small service vehicles zipping back and forth. She took a deep breath, preparing for what she knew would be a turning point. Not just for her, but for those who had dismissed her. Maintaining her composed demeanor, Alice waited as passengers began lining up to disembark. She didn't rush. Each passing moment only heightened her focus and resolve. From a distance, Bryce and Maddie lingered at the rear of the cabin, whispering anxiously. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by a sense of unease. The stares of the other passengers, and the calm but commanding presence of Alice, had made them aware that something was amiss. Meanwhile, Claire struggled to maintain her professional facade, but her movements were clumsier than before. When her eyes met Alice's, she quickly averted them, her earlier confidence now reduced to a thin veneer. As Alice stepped off the plane, the atmosphere outside shifted completely. Under the glare of the terminal's bright lights, a group of well-dressed individuals stood waiting. At the front of the group was Michael Hayes, the airline's CEO, exuding an air of authority and poise. His eyes lit up as he spotted Alice, and he approached her with an outstretched hand and a welcoming smile. "Ms. Johnson, it's an honor to meet you," Michael said, his voice resonating with respect. "A pleasure to meet you as well, Mr. Hayes," Alice replied, shaking his hand with the quiet confidence she always carried. The scene was impossible to ignore. Maddie, Bryce, and Carl stood nearby, staring at Alice and Michael in stunned silence. They exchanged bewildered glances as if trying to comprehend what was happening. Bryce, driven by instinct, stepped forward hesitantly, forcing a nervous smile. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice faltering, "I think there might have been some misunderstanding on the flight. We truly didn't mean any offense." Michael turned to Bryce, raising a hand to silence him. "Not another word," he said, his tone firm but measured. "Today is not the time for excuses." Bryce froze, his face paling. Behind him, Maddie clasped her hands tightly, while Carl stared at the ground, avoiding everyone's gaze. Michael turned back to Alice. "Everyone here is ready to hear your directives," he said, his voice steady but weighty. Alice surveyed the group, her gaze lingering on Maddie, Bryce, and Carl. The arrogance and condescension they had displayed earlier were nowhere to be seen. Stepping forward, Alice spoke with calm authority. "Before we proceed, I want to make one thing clear. What happened today wasn't just a lapse in professionalism, it was a reflection of an attitude of disdain for customers, a lack of respect, and a failure to take responsibility." Maddie opened her mouth to respond, but the intensity of Alice's gaze silenced her. "I'm not here to listen to excuses," Alice continued, her voice cutting through the air. "I'm here to ensure that these actions are never repeated. Not with me, and not with any other passenger." Michael nodded solemnly, his expression resolute. "Everything you've said is right. I guarantee that this airline will take immediate action to change its culture and improve its service. Those responsible for today's incidents will be suspended pending investigation." His declaration landed like a thunderclap in the terminal. Maddie covered her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. Bryce clenched his fists, his face taut as he tried to mask his unease. Carl let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping as though resigning himself to the inevitable. Alice showed no signs of triumph or gloating. Her gaze remained composed but commanding. This wasn't about personal victory, it was a pivotal step in her ongoing fight to reform a deeply flawed system. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Alice said, turning to Michael. "I look forward to seeing real change." Michael bowed his head slightly, his tone sincere. "We won't let you down." Alice gave a small nod before walking away, leaving the crew behind in an atmosphere thick with tension. Maddie glanced nervously at Bryce, but neither of them said a word. They knew that any attempt at justification would be meaningless now. Alice walked with measured calm, exuding quiet power. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Alice stepped into the small conference room in the airport, where Michael Hayes and the leadership team had arranged a meeting with the employees involved in the incident. The room was heavy with tension, so silent that the ticking of a clock could be heard. Maddie, Bryce, and Carl had been summoned and now sat waiting, their faces etched with worry and unease. Alice entered with an air of confidence, though not arrogance. Her gaze swept over each person, pausing long enough for them to feel the weight of her presence. Michael stood beside her, his expression stern, underscoring the seriousness of this meeting. Alice approached the conference table, gently set her handbag on a chair, and stood upright, looking directly at Maddie, Bryce, and Carl. She remained silent for a few moments, letting the room's atmosphere grow even more charged. "Do you know why you're here?" Alice's voice cut through the stillness, calm but sharp. Maddie looked up, her eyes filled with apprehension. "Because of what happened on the flight," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Exactly." Alice nodded, her gaze unwavering. "But to be clear, I want to hear it from you. What happened on the flight today?" Maddie lowered her head, her hands clenched on her lap. She opened her mouth but failed to form any coherent words. Bryce, attempting to maintain a composed demeanor, betrayed his unease through his shifting eyes. Carl, typically quiet, stared at the floor, his shoulders sagging under the weight of shame. Finally, Maddie drew a shaky breath and stammered. I didn't mean. I think there was some misunderstanding. I shouldn't have acted like that." Her voice cracked as tears began streaming down her face. Bryce glanced at Maddie, then cleared his throat and reluctantly spoke. "We just didn't realize who she was. I think this has all been blown out of proportion." He shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but his darting eyes betrayed his discomfort. Alice held her gaze on Bryce until he fell silent. She then turned to Carl, who had yet to say anything. "And what about you, Carl? What do you have to say about your actions today?" Carl lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. He sighed deeply, shaking his head. "I have no excuse," he said, his voice low and halting. "I acted wrongly. I regret it." Alice nodded slowly, taking a step closer to them. Her tone remained calm, but carried an undeniable edge. "What you did today wasn't just an insult to me. It insulted everyone who has ever been dismissed because of prejudice, because of appearances, or because of the narrow assumptions you imposed on them." She turned her sharp gaze to Maddie, who was trying to wipe her tears. "Maddie, you assumed someone like me didn't belong in first class, didn't you? Bryce, you thought I was making a fuss over nothing. Carl, you treated my luggage like it was an insignificant, worthless object." Her words cut through the air like a blade, leaving the trio unable to meet her eyes. "Do you understand that these small actions create lasting wounds?" Alice continued, her voice rising in strength. "The judgmental looks, the snide remarks, the unspoken contempt, they don't just harm individuals. They perpetuate a system riddled with prejudice and injustice." The room was steeped in silence. No one dared to respond. Maddie sobbed quietly. Bryce sighed and ran a hand through his hair, while Carl kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to face Alice's piercing gaze. Michael, standing beside Alice, broke the silence. "Ms. Johnson, would you like to recommend a specific course of action?" Alice turned to him, shaking her head gently. "I'm not here to punish. That's not my goal. But I do expect accountability and action to make things right." She shifted her focus back to Maddie, Bryce, and Carl, her expression softening slightly but still resolute. "I hope this will serve as a lesson for you to change. Because if it doesn't, you won't just hurt passengers. You'll damage your integrity." Taking a step back, Alice swept her gaze over them one last time, as if delivering a final warning. "I don't want to see this happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else." Michael nodded, his stern expression directed at the employees. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Maddie whispered through her tears. Bryce and Carl both nodded silently. Alice said nothing further. She turned and walked out of the room with unwavering poise. This wasn't the end, but the beginning of the change she had always envisioned. As Alice stepped out into the hallway, the light seemed softer, but the tension still lingered in the air. Inside the room, Michael Hayes remained silent for a moment, his eyes scanning Maddie, Bryce, and Carl, who were still sitting in stunned discomfort. "What you just heard from Ms. Johnson," Michael began, his voice firm, "wasn't just a passenger's feedback. It was a lesson for all of us. This isn't simply a personal issue. It's a sign that our workplace culture needs immediate change." Bryce frowned slightly, but remained silent. Maddie hastily wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. Carl lifted his head, his expression resigned as if he already understood what was coming. Michael continued. "Effective immediately. All of you will be suspended to facilitate an internal investigation. This isn't meant as punishment. It's an opportunity for us to assess the situation fairly and transparently." His statement landed like a heavy stone, further thickening the already tense atmosphere. Maddie opened her mouth as if to speak, but Michael's unyielding gaze silenced her. "And this won't stop here," Michael emphasized. "The entire workforce, from management to ground staff, will be required to undergo mandatory training on diversity and inclusion. We must ensure that everyone understands their responsibility in fostering a respectful and equitable environment. From across the table, Sarah Williams, a senior executive with an air of elegance and sharp intelligence, spoke up. "I completely agree, Michael," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. "However, I believe we need to go further. Training is just the beginning. We need a monitoring mechanism to ensure policies are consistently enforced." Michael nodded, his respect for Sarah evident in his expression. "Do you have a specific proposal, Sarah?" Sarah leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. "I propose establishing an independent oversight committee, including representatives from various departments within the company and external experts. This committee would be responsible for monitoring, evaluating, and reporting on behavior and workplace culture." A flicker of agreement passed through Michael's eyes. "That's an excellent idea," he said. "Begin planning its implementation immediately. I want a detailed report within 2 weeks." Sarah nodded, jotting down notes quickly. Maddie, Bryce, and Carl seemed to shrink in their seats as they listened to the discussion. They understood that this was no longer a localized issue. It had become the catalyst for a systemic overhaul. Michael turned back to the employees, his gaze softening slightly but remaining firm. "This isn't the end for you, but it's the beginning of a journey where you'll need to take responsibility. See this as an opportunity to learn and grow. If not, you won't have a place in this organization." The room fell silent again. Bryce nodded, though his face remained tense. Maddie murmured a quiet apology, while Carl simply bowed his head. Michael exhaled deeply and turned to Sarah. "We'll announce this new plan to the entire company. I want it executed transparently and responsibly." Standing outside in the hallway, Alice heard footsteps as Michael exited the room. When he saw her, he nodded slightly, as if to confirm that everything had been handled as she had hoped. "Miss Johnson," Michael said, his voice filled with gratitude, "thank you for helping us recognize our shortcomings. I promise we will change, and we'll start today." Alice replied with a faint but resolute smile. "I trust you, Michael. But remember, real change comes from action." Alice stepped into the press conference room, where camera flashes flickered incessantly, and every seat was occupied by journalists from major media outlets. The airline's logo was prominently displayed on the backdrop behind her, serving as a reminder of the immense responsibility she was about to shoulder. Beside her stood Michael Hayes and Sarah Williams, who had worked alongside her in the initiative to reform the company's culture. Alice stood tall at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edge. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering just long enough to command absolute silence. When she began to speak, her voice was clear and confident, as though addressing each person individually. "Thank you all for being here today," Alice began, her tone calm yet laden with significance. "I stand before you not only as the largest shareholder and new owner of this airline, but also as someone who has personally experienced disrespect within a system that demands change." The room was so quiet that the sound of journalists' pens scribbling could be heard. Alice continued, her eyes shining with determination. "The events of today's flight serve as a painful reminder that inequality and prejudice are not unfamiliar issues. But I'm not here to recount a personal experience. I'm here to emphasize that small, thoughtless actions don't just harm individuals. They damage the reputation of an entire organization." She paused briefly, allowing her words to sink into the minds of everyone in the room. "Starting today, we will implement a series of comprehensive changes," Alice declared. First, all employees will participate in mandatory training programs on diversity, inclusion, and customer respect. We won't just teach professionalism, we will focus on understanding the values of equity and fairness. The camera flashes lit up again, and several reporters hurriedly jotted down notes. Alice pressed on. Second, we will enforce a zero-tolerance policy for any discriminatory behavior. Any employee who violates this policy will be held accountable and face strict disciplinary actions, including termination. A murmur of whispers rippled through the reporters, but no one interrupted her speech. Alice seized the opportunity to drive home an even more significant message. "But let me be clear about one thing," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Change doesn't start with employees. It begins with leadership. We, those in the highest positions, must bear the greatest responsibility for fostering a culture of transparency, fairness, and respect." Michael nodded in agreement from behind her, and Sarah smiled, swiftly taking notes in her notebook. Unexpectedly, a woman stood up from the front row. It was Anna Miller, who had witnessed everything that happened on the flight. She stepped forward, holding a phone in her hand, drawing all eyes toward her. "Miss Johnson," Anna said, her voice clear but laden with emotion, "I have something to share with everyone here." Alice gave a small nod, yielding the floor to Anna. Anna turned her phone's screen toward the journalists and played a video she had recorded on the flight. In the video, the flight attendants' mocking remarks, their behavior toward Alice, and even the footage of her luggage being roughly handled were vividly displayed. The room buzzed with activity. Reporters murmured, and some immediately began asking questions. However, Alice raised her hand, signaling for silence. "When I speak about change," Alice said, her voice stronger than ever, "this is precisely why. These actions don't just harm one person. They erode the trust of our customers in our brand. But today, I stand here to promise that this will never happen again." She turned to Anna, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Anna, for standing up and showing us that it's never too late to act." Anna nodded, a small smile gracing her lips as she returned to her seat. Alice concluded her speech with a powerful declaration. "From today onward, we will not only build a better airline, but we will also create an environment where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, feels respected and welcomed." The press conference erupted into applause. Journalists stood, some continuing to take notes while others scrambled to ask questions. But Alice knew her message had landed exactly as she intended. Michael stepped up to the podium and shook Alice's hand. "Thank you, Alice," he said. "Your vision and commitment are exactly what we need to move forward." Alice nodded slightly and stepped away from the podium with confidence. She knew this was only the beginning, but it was the right start. After the groundbreaking press conference, Bryce returned home feeling heavy-hearted. He sat alone in his small apartment, the light from his laptop casting a pale glow on his anxious face. His inbox was flooded with emails from colleagues, some curious about the incident, others offering perfunctory greetings. No one mentioned his suspension directly, but Bryce was acutely aware he was teetering on the brink of unemployment. A week later, he decided to apply for a position at a regional airline, hoping to start over. Though smaller, the airline had a reputation for giving opportunities to those with experience at major carriers. Bryce prepared meticulously for the interview, donning a sharp suit and attempting to project confidence he didn't truly feel. The interview took place in a small but professional meeting room. The interviewer, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, flipped through Bryce's resume with scrutiny. You worked at a major airline. Why did you leave? The man asked, his piercing gaze locked on Bryce. Bryce forced a smile, but it quickly faltered under the weight of the question. I wanted to seek new opportunities, he said, his voice slightly trembling. I thought a smaller environment might suit me better. The interviewer remained silent, his eyes still on the resume. We've received some information about a recent incident involving you, he said, looking up. Care to elaborate? Bryce froze, his blood running cold. He struggled to find the right words but couldn't muster anything convincing. Bryce stammered, trying to steady his voice. It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, and I've learned my lesson. The interviewer's expression didn't change. I see. But we prioritize building a team that excels not only in skills, but also in professional ethics. Based on what I know, I'm afraid we can't move forward with you. The words struck Bryce like a blade, slicing through his faint hope. He left the interview feeling hollow, his heavy footsteps echoing as he walked away from the building. On his way home, Bryce couldn't stop replaying the consequences of his careless actions. He hadn't just lost his old job, he had tarnished his reputation, sending his career into a tailspin. Yet, instead of wallowing in self-pity, Bryce realized it was time for a change. He enrolled in a personal development course where he learned about effective communication, emotional management, and building empathy. The first session took place in a small room with over 20 participants, each with their own stories of mistakes and second chances. The instructor, an older woman with a calm demeanor, began with a simple yet profound question. Have you ever thought about how your small actions can have a big impact on others? Bryce remained silent, but the question hit him deeply. He reflected on his mocking words to Alice, the casual dismissiveness he once thought was harmless. Now he understood those small actions had left indelible scars, not only on others, but on himself. Throughout the course, Bryce gradually shifted his perspective on himself and his interactions with the world. He learned to listen rather than judge and to take responsibility instead of making excuses. One day, after class, Bryce wrote an email to Alice. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. He simply acknowledged his mistakes and vowed never to repeat them. He never received a reply, but just writing the email felt like a significant step forward. Bryce knew reclaiming his integrity wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Alice Johnson closed the door to her suite, leaving behind a long and tumultuous day. The room was bathed in soft, golden light, but Alice still felt exhaustion in every step. She slipped off her black blazer, draped it over a chair, and sank into the plush sofa by the window. Her eyes shut briefly, attempting to block out the noise of the bustling city beyond. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to relax, her mind kept spinning. She replayed every detail of the day, the disdainful looks, the mocking remarks, and the tense confrontations with Maddie, Bryce, and Carl. Though everything had gone according to plan, Alice couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. She knew today's events were merely the tip of the iceberg. She rose and walked to the large window where the city's lights twinkled against the night sky. The towering skyscrapers and busy traffic painted a vibrant picture of activity. But inside, Alice felt an unusual calm. She gazed down and imagined the nameless individuals in the chaotic flow below. People who, like her, had faced injustices yet lacked the means or opportunity to fight back. The thought tugged at her heart. Alice reflected on her journey, recalling the grueling early days when she had to fight to prove her worth. As a black woman, she had faced countless prejudices and obstacles. She remembered being overlooked in meetings, receiving cold rejections from investors, and enduring cruel, sarcastic remarks. But Alice had never let those experiences defeat her. She had turned doubt into determination, climbing step by step to a position where her value was undeniable. Today, she was more than a successful entrepreneur. She was someone capable of effecting real change, and she knew she had to do more. Alice returned to the desk, opened her laptop, and began typing the first lines of a new plan, establishing a charitable foundation. She had considered the idea for a while, but today's events had solidified her resolve to bring it to life. Alice envisioned the foundation not just as a means to support victims of discrimination, but as a platform to empower them, give them a voice, and challenge unjust systems. She started outlining the foundation's primary goals: providing legal and financial support for victims of discrimination, creating a platform for sharing personal stories to raise public awareness, organizing educational programs to promote diversity and inclusion within service industries. Alice imagined a strong organization under the name Wings of Dignity. The name symbolized both the airline industry and the freedom, dignity, and equality she aimed to uphold for everyone. As she wrote the action plan, she paused, leaning back in her chair with a distant gaze. Memories of being underestimated because of her background and judged by appearances flooded her thoughts. She knew there were countless others like her out there, people who didn't have the voice or the opportunities to change their circumstances. Alice took a sip of water and resumed writing. The foundation would collaborate with legal experts, nonprofit organizations, and major corporations to ensure that these changes weren't just theoretical, but implemented in practice. She thought about people like Anna Miller, those brave enough to step forward, witness, and support others. The foundation would also work to amplify stories like Anna's, not only as lessons but as calls to action. When she finished drafting the document, Alice saved the file and closed her laptop. A sense of relief mixed with determination filled her. She turned back to the window, taking one last look at the city. The street lights had thinned out, but the towering building still glowed, a reminder that life never stops. Alice smiled faintly and said to herself, "This is only the beginning, and I'm not stopping here." The bustling city greeted the morning with the first rays of sunlight streaming through hotel curtains, illuminating the suite where Alice Johnson was preparing for a new day. Today, she would take to the skies again, but this flight carried an entirely different significance. It wasn't just a personal journey, it was a symbol of the change she had ignited, not just for herself but for those who couldn't raise their voices. Alice rose from the bed, adjusting the hem of the blazer she had carefully selected. Her polished outfit wasn't just preparation for the day, but a statement of the confidence and authority she had earned through her perseverance. She opened her laptop and reviewed the final details of her plan for the Wings of Dignity Foundation. A bold initiative aimed at supporting those who, like her, had faced injustice in similar circumstances. The foundation's objectives were clearly defined, providing legal aid, raising awareness about diversity and inclusion, and enforcing zero-tolerance policies against discrimination. She knew this was only the first step, but it would serve as a solid foundation for sustainable, systemic change. The chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. A message from Michael Hayes appeared on the screen. "Thank you for your vision, which has transformed the organization. We won't let you down." Alice smiled, feeling a fleeting sense of relief. She typed a quick response. "We still have much to do." After sending the message, Alice closed her laptop and stepped out of the room. She took a moment to glance around, cherishing the rare quiet moments before diving back into the whirlwind of work. Down in the hotel lobby, her driver awaited. Alice climbed into the car, watching the crowded streets come alive through the window. Each face, each figure, seemed to carry a story, a dream, or perhaps an unspoken struggle. She thought of those who had endured injustices silently, fueling her determination. At the airport, Alice approached the check-in counter. This time, the staff greeted her with warm smiles, their professionalism unmarred by prejudice. Alice returned the smile, noting that the changes she was championing were beginning to take root, however small. On board the plane, she was welcomed warmly by the cabin crew. Their sincere demeanor and professional gestures stood in stark contrast to the events of her last flight. Alice settled into her first-class seat, appreciating the calm ambiance around her. As the plane ascended through the clouds, Alice gazed out the window, where the vast sky stretched endlessly. The view reminded her that the journey ahead was long. For Alice, justice wasn't about punishing those who erred, but building a system where fairness and respect were fundamental. She recalled yesterday's press conference. Anna Miller, who had quietly recorded and shared the truth from the flight, had become an unexpected but vital ally in reinforcing Alice's message. Anna's courage was a testament to the power of small actions to spark significant change. Alice smiled softly as she thought about Anna's video. It not only exposed wrongdoings but also inspired empathy and awareness in the community. This was the power of truth, and Alice knew she had to wield it to drive lasting change. A flight attendant approached, placing a cup of tea gently on Alice's table. "Have a great flight, ma'am," she said with a genuine smile. "Thank you," Alice replied, her expression softening. As the plane soared higher, Alice opened her phone and reviewed her to-do list. At the top was the entry: "Establish the Wings of Dignity Foundation." She added a note: "Find strategic partners to scale the foundation within its first year." Beneath the note, a new message appeared from Michael Hayes: "Your dedication is the greatest inspiration for our team." Alice read the message, feeling both content and resolute. She typed a final reply: "This is just the beginning. We'll keep reaching higher." As the plane glided through the clouds, Alice sat still, her gaze fixed ahead. To her, the future wasn't just something to dream about, it was something to build. And she knew this journey was only beginning. The story of Alice Johnson is a powerful reminder that anyone can turn adversity into motivation for change. What do you think of Alice's actions? If you were in her position, how would you confront injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful content. Let's spread the message of positive change together.